Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, as Dan said, I am a first-time speaker, and after hyping everyone up, I hope I live up to those expectations. So my talk is keeping a cool head in the eye of the storm. This is kind of my story around incident response leadership and why it's important. So let's start off with who I am. I am a former security engineer and incident responder at CSG. I'm also the former forensics lead for TrueSec North America. And I'm also a cat owner, as you guys can see with that picture. So let's talk about what actually incident response is. It's a term that's used pretty widely throughout the InfoSec community, and finding an actual definition is kind of hard. Basically, incident response, is really responding and detecting and handling an actual incident from a security standpoint. And this talks about how an incident response happens in phases, and I'll tell you from experience, this is true, but also not true. Whenever I'm doing anything from an incident response standpoint, I'm thinking about the entire incident response aspect. How do I take my detection and analysis and put it into containment and recovery? One of the things to note that I think is really kind of cool about incident response is from the most basic incident from a single computer being compromised to thousands of enterprise hosts being compromised, the only thing that ever really changes is the scope from incident response. At the core, what you're doing is walking through the attacker's kill chain, essentially. So if we think incident response, is not something that is necessarily overly complicated from a, action standpoint, why do we even care about incident response leadership? It should be something that all of us can do on a day-to-day basis. Well, let's talk about a scenario. Scenario, it's a Friday night, as it always is, mind you, and at 2 o'clock your phone goes off, you get called into the office. The sysadmin has seen a note saying pay a ransom. You get told to call on your team, and you call on your team. It's about 5 people. You're driving into the office, and you're all very upset because it's 2 a.m., and your cats are very upset with you, mind you. They don't want to sleep with you ever again. So you get into the office, and you're told, you're going to fix this. You're going to work 24/7 until this is done. Mind you, this is an actual scenario that I have heard from other incident responders. So you're working 24/7, you're going through, you're trying to get your hand around it. In the morning, 8 o'clock, someone comes in and says, hey, do we see an exfiltration? You stop. You have not been looking for exfiltration. You've been trying to do incident response and trying to figure out what actually happened. So you switch gears. 4 hours later, you actually get asked another question. The board comes in and says, hey, are the attackers still there? Can we stand up our, can we stand up production and start going again? We're just going to do forensics after. Another 4 hours passes, another question. Another 4 hours, another question. By the end of the weekend, you've got nothing done. And finally, someone comes in and tells you, hey, you're done. You don't have any sort of instant response. You haven't actually figured anything out. We're calling in an outside team. You've been told you failed. So why did that just happen? Why does this very simple, from a technical perspective, you're just doing what you do on a day-to-day basis as part of a SOC or as part of a forensic standpoint, why did you just fail? And the reason is incident response is stressful. I can tell you firsthand that incident response, your pressure is at a 10. You are being told you're costing the company millions every hour that something is down. Every time you can't answer a question, someone is potentially getting fired because there's hot heads. It's a bad time. During this time and during this stress, it all affects your OODA loop. And this is probably one of the most important aspects of this talk and why incident response leadership is so important, is that OODA loop. This loop is your basic decision-making loop that you do on a day-to-day basis. When I get asked what I want for dinner, well, first off, I ask my girlfriend, and she tells me whatever you want. And I say, okay, all right, well, let me think about this. So I observe, hey, am I hungry? What am I hungry for? I orient. I think about all the options. Do I have steak in the freezer? Do I have fridge? Do I have chicken, laid out? Finally, after a little bit, I decide on that. I say, okay, I want this. And then finally, I make it. That's that loop. That is the basic decision-making loop you do every day. It is also the single most important variable in any emergency situation. And the reason incident response leadership is so important is because you need that loop to be as short as possible. Otherwise, you will get stuck in mud. Your gears will continue to just basically spin, and you won't get anything done if you spend all of your time basically making decisions and not doing anything. So I'm going to tell a story here. Basically, when I have one of the most, I guess, stressful incidents that I've been in was one where I was not the first responder. My company got called in as a second responder. This was a ransomware incident involving several thousand hosts, and we were told, hey, you guys got to come in because one of a different vendor screwed up, is the way the customer said it. So I came in, and basically we were told the other incident responders, they had no idea what they were talking about. They didn't, communicate with us, or they were doing it really infrequently. We had to ask them a bunch of questions, and they didn't have any answers. At the end, they didn't know what we were trying to look for. They told us a bunch of stuff about, IOCs and TTPs, but they didn't really tell us what happened in the incident. And by the end of this incident, we had to kick them off because their guys were tired. They weren't able to really respond to stuff, and they kept giving us longer and longer deadlines. From my standpoint and from my team's standpoint, when we were told all this, it was pretty clear to us that these guys, didn't have very good leadership. The people, we knew the people. They were technical people. They were good at forensics. They were good at incident response. Their leadership had failed them by bringing them onto this incident, not giving them a clear picture of what they needed to do, and not basically setting them up for success. And it cost their company a large contract, millions of dollars, and also made us millions of dollars, but can't really be too happy about that. So I can stand up here, right, and I can tell everyone, hey, don't run an incident like this, but how should you actually run one? And this is kind of the main point of this talk. You need to be the dog in the middle of the fire. You have to think when everything is burning down around you that you will be fine and that you have control of this. And you're lying to yourself. I'm gonna be completely honest. Whenever I get into an incident, I lie to myself every single day that this is gonna be okay. I'm not gonna work, super long hours. I am gonna mow the grass, which does not happen, and I'm gonna be okay. First thing you have to do is you have to determine your scope and your goal. This is critical. I have seen so many companies say, we want instant response, and then I ask, okay, what does instant response mean to you? And they say, I don't know. You have to know what your business needs. Does it need to know all the technical, gory details of how the attacker moved through an incident? Or do you just need to know, this was how they got in, this is what they did, they're out now. That's a legitimate thing. You need to know when that incident actually ends, right? So there's always going to be a point when you can investigate further. You can get down completely into the weeds with this stuff, but most of the time you don't need that. You have to know, when am I going to accept that this incident is over, that I have done enough, that I can reasonably say to someone who controls purse strings and controls my job that they're not coming back and they're out of there. And you gotta know what that is. And this kind of plays into the concept of risk management. During an incident, you think all the stuff goes out the window. It doesn't. There is always going to be communication with stakeholders and people who care about, that business, that are going to have different opinions on what safe means. And you have to decide that beforehand, because otherwise you will get into a room and you guys will argue for an hour, and that meeting, will be like my usual Wednesday meetings. And then finally, guys, the big thing on this is it's okay to call to help on these. Incident response is a pretty specialized skill set for dealing with that sort of stress and that pressure. There's reasons why people have IR retainers. Most people have those at this point. I know that the industry is moving to a lot of those. It's generally a good idea. It's really hard to have an in-house incident responder team that's been prepped, that has done all of the training beforehand, and has basically been able to handle something that is really large. In my experience, when I moved from internal incident response to external, I was kind of scared for the companies that I worked at before. Not because they were bad at what they did, not because they didn't know how to do incident response, but because the pressure is just different when there's a catastrophe versus there's been maybe a data breach or a leak, as opposed to everything's on fire, no one can work, the world is falling apart. It's just completely different. Next thing to talk about is proper communication strategies. And you guys can walk out now. This isn't very technical. Basically, communication strategies are probably the lifeblood of your incident response team. Knowing how to talk to each other in an incident is going to be the most critical thing that you do. I talk to my team every day about, hey, we have to know when we're doing this incident response, who has the source of truth, who has this Excel spreadsheet, or who is setting this notepad and taking stuff down and is actually writing this stuff. Because we can talk to each other, but if none of that gets basically written down, nothing's going to happen with it. CSG, and I hope John doesn't, John eventually will maybe offer me another job if I say this, but we'll see, is they use this thing called a CAN report, conditions, actions, needs. It's a fantastic template for going over, what you need to do during an incident. You basically lay things out, and it allows you to talk about an incident intelligently. Because if you just go into an incident and say, hey, what do you guys need? It's not going to go very well. People are going to have different responses, and they're not going to know what information they need to pass on. Set a consistent time interval. That's also a big thing. There has been some incidents where there's a client who wants to talk to me every 30 minutes, and then maybe another hour after that, and then 45 minutes, and then 15 minutes, or 5 minutes after because they got a question. It doesn't work well. I have to get my job done. Your incident responders need to do their jobs. So set a time. TrueSec used 4 hours. That's also when I put in my billable hours, which was nice for me. And basically, it allowed the forensic examiners to go in and say, okay, what do we know now? Go through, discover the stuff that we need to, and then go back and talk to the client and let them know this is what needs to happen. Talk about communication, just strategies and what you're doing, inbound versus out of band. Are you guys okay with your incident responder chats being leaked online? It's okay if you say okay on that, by the way. You don't have to use out of band communication. From an incident response standpoint, if your communication gets leaked online, it probably doesn't really affect you. It might just be a little bit embarrassing. So, do this training as well beforehand. There's a lot of prep that goes into communication. CSG, every company I've worked at has done a really good job of preparing me from an incident response standpoint to talk to other people, because I have to do this sort of communication not during a live incident, not during the world's burning down. It's not 2 a.m. I can get all this stuff done beforehand, and I'm training as I fight. And then finally, something to take away for anyone here who's maybe a bit higher level in the kind of corporate hierarchy is limit the amount of hops. I know it's a really scary concept, but your board can talk directly to an incident responder. They might not be trained to do that. They might not know how to talk to the board, and the board might not know how to talk to an incident responder. But plain telephone will kill an incident. Every time that you have to communicate through a channel, you will lose context, you'll lose technical details, and people will get frustrated because questions that they're asking will not be answered to what they want, to the detail they want. I've seen this happen before. I've seen this happen at clients who basically want to insulate their board from what an actual incident is, and they will come back very upset because they'll have asked a question, we'll have answered it, and the answer just won't get communicated in an effective manner. So limit that hops. Let people talk, get into a regular meeting, and sit there. You guys, during an incident response, you're all on the same level. You're all trying to accomplish the same thing. There's not a lot of difference from a strategy standpoint. Finally, manage your human resources. This is one of the biggest things that I see incident response teams do, and is probably the biggest sin in that scenario that I talked about there. Set up your shifts if you're going to work 24 hours. 10 hours maximum is generally what I say. You can do more. My experience is anything over 12, your incident responders will effectively be worthless. They just can't do it. They'll say they can, but they will. The effectiveness will just go way down. Also note that when you're doing these shifts, if people are working overnight, if they're not used to that sleep schedule, they're going to be less effective than the people that do, that are working during the day. So understand that those tasks that they're doing need to be less technical. And piggybacking on that, all of these shifts make people do stuff outside of one task during those shifts. I have not met a single person that can go through network logs for 10 hours straight. If any of you guys can, please come talk to me. I'd really like to actually meet you, but it just doesn't happen. You will basically get lost in the sauce is what we said at TrueSec. You'll get there, you'll see too many network logs, and that regular HTTP request over port 80 is going to look really scary to you at the end of it. Just like if I say the word, done 40 times, it's going to sound really weird in my head. It's the exact same concept. Handoff meetings, communication, that sort of thing, make sure that gets down too. Whenever you're working in shifts, you have to have people that know how to communicate, even when they're tired and when they're want to go to bed or when they want to go eat or something like that. Talk about reducing stress outside of it. You got to lower that OODA loop somehow. Reduce the amount of decisions. I don't have to ask my girlfriend during an incident, what should we have for dinner, because my company's generally just going to decide for me, which might sound awful because I don't like Domino's pizza for the 4th time in a row, but it makes it really easy on me because I don't have to decide dinner. No one has to decide dinner. They're just ordering it for me. Here, go put in this code and go get dinner. It's fine. They never really decided to say yes on my request to have someone mow my lawn, but I was working on that, I promise. So as you're working through this stuff, and as you know about these human resources, is people do, as they're doing these things, they do start to get a little lost. They do start to worry about, am I doing the right thing? Forensics work is very much a gray zone. You're thinking a lot about, hey, is this actually related to the incident, or is this not related to the incident? So one of the things that I found was really helpful was also working in pairs. This was really nice. We did basically forensics in teams of 2. If I talk to, if I'm looking at logs, I'm going to have another guy or another girl taking a look at the stuff that I'm saying is bad, and they will confirm or we'll say no. Or maybe we'll disagree and we get to argue about it, and it's a nice little, kind of interruption in this. So all of these strategies are really for making sure that your resources, the incident responders, are able to do their jobs. How much time do I have, by the way?
4 minutes.
4 minutes, sweet. So some final thoughts, and kind of pulling into that is, incident response is a marathon, not a sprint. So when we're talking about managing your human resources, understand that incident response engagements do not last 1 day. They don't last 2 days. They can last weeks. And you cannot burn your people out by going through just 24 hours a day or 10-hour shifts for 3 weeks at a time. It's not going to be sustainable. The other cool thing about this that I think from an incident response standpoint is something to remember is that attackers do have agency. We're all in this field because for different reasons, but the reason I'm in it is because I get to basically go off against bad guys and say, hey, I'm going to try to stop you from doing what you want to do. But they also have the ability to say, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to let you investigate or be able to get these logs, things like that. So they do have agency. All your best laid plans will go out the window if the attacker says, no, we're not going to let you do that. Failing an incident response is almost always a leadership problem. If any of you guys have ever been said, hey, you don't know how to incident response or you didn't do a good job on this investigation, I'm going to be honest, it's going to be a leadership problem. Your leadership is the one that sets you up for success. If you have been trained from a forensic standpoint, if you know the technical details from a forensics standpoint or from an incident response standpoint, you can do this. It's going to be a leadership problem that has not prepared you well, not set up the right environment, that will be the ones that fail you. I can do 5,000 hosts from a forensic standpoint, and the only thing that is different from me and you is my leadership was the one that prepared you. I guess is how I would kind of talk about that. And then finally, best incident response. We can talk about incident response till I'm blue in the face, but the best incident response is going to be worse than the worst security control. Make sure you get your configurations figured out. Try not to have an incident response. It's generally not something that you want to have happen. And even though you're prepared for it, don't minimize the incidents when they do happen. So thank you guys for accepting my talk, and thank you guys for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of incident responses, you're driving into the office. Obviously with COVID, that pushed a lot of it to work from home. Has incident response changed and adapted to that, when you don't have to drive into the office to take care of it, you can do it now from the comfort of your house, or do they still want people showing up because there are less distractions? I mean, it's all kind of variables of how people work. We work better at home than the person in the office.
So it's a fantastic question. It's actually something that I kind of have a hot take on. I prefer incident response remotely. It allows me to communicate both in text and in person, or through video. The benefits of that are that you're not talking to someone in person and expecting other people to remember things. That communication aspect of incident response is so important that if all you're doing is talking to each other and not writing it down, nothing's going to get done. But if you're remote, someone's going to type that in somewhere. Someone's going to type it into a chat. Someone's going to have an opinion that they're going to type in a chat, and it makes things easier. The other part of that is that driving time, that does take up maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour every day. You get more out of your incident responders. It's easier to decompress. They're easier to go take a break, go play with your cats, something like that. So it has definitely changed. I was doing incident response at an international level, talking to people in Sweden sort of thing, and it worked just as well as if I was in the office. Go ahead.
When you're setting up to be on retainer for a company, then do you have a process beforehand such that they lay out, here's the layout of all of our systems, all the interdependencies of these systems depend on those, such that when you're going in and then dealing with the situation, you say, okay, this is the scope of the problem, and you're not blinded by, here's what we're fighting, but the problem really is over here that we weren't told about.
I will be 100% honest, that has never been the case. A lot of companies have thought that was the case. I've been provided fantastic lists of machines and dependencies. They have never been accurate. And it's, yeah, I don't want to say it like that, but it's just the case. I've never found a place that knows how to do it. And we are at time. If you guys have any other questions, I'm also happy to talk about it in the hall. Thank you, everyone.